I have the pleasure now of introducing my good friend Heather Hurlburt, who's going to moderate this panel that looks at how American global leadership is viewed from outside the United States. Heather Hurlburt is Senior Advisor and former Executive Director of the National Security Network. She has broad foreign policy expertise. Most recently, her work has focused on counterterrorism, resilience, and the nexus of civilian and military approaches to conflict resolution. Previously, Heather ran her own communications and strategy practice, working on global issues with political, entertainment, and educational leaders. From 1995 to 2001, she served in the Clinton administration as Special Assistant and Speechwriter to the President, speechwriter for Secretaries of State Albright and Christopher, and was a member of the State Department's Policy and Planning staff. She's also worked with the International Crisis Group, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and the Congressional Helsinki Commission. Please join me in welcoming Heather Hurlburt in this panel.
Well, we were all remarking that that's quite a tough act to follow on the one hand. On the other hand, it's going to be quite a fun act to follow, and I can't think of two more interesting interlocutors to talk about what it's like to try to work with the United States to promote human rights than the two gentlemen that I've got on the panel this afternoon. You have their bios in the packet, so I'd like to maybe point out a couple of things you don't know about them. Lord David Owen is best known to Americans for his work on what became the Vance-Owen Plan and his years of hard labor as the EU's negotiator for the Balkans from 1992 to 95. But he held for many years, until it was, I think, eclipsed only recently, the record for being the UK's youngest foreign minister. In the 1970s, appropriately enough, given the video we just saw, when he did a great deal for the cause of human rights and national self-determination in Africa, which will, I think, lead us to some really interesting conversation this afternoon, and something unusual in our field. He is trained as a physician. So he comes to this with a very different, or perhaps not different at all, set of core values about what humanity and human beings mean. Dr. Lloyd Axworthy, our neighbor to the north, was Canada's foreign minister for only 4 years. It seemed like much, much longer.
It did, yeah, it did.
And somehow, during that span of time, he and Canada managed to leave us with the International Criminal Court, the Landmine Treaty, the Protocol on Child Soldiers, and the seeds of what later became the Responsibility to Protect Doctrine. So these two gentlemen between them have done really as much as any leader you could think of to shape the environment for promoting human rights internationally that the U.S. faces. Were both steadfast partners of the United States, and also, I can say, having served in government during both of their tenure, someone whose names one could hear the principals muttering under their breaths at various times. So I'm really hoping that this conversation will be a little bit like eavesdropping on what it is that people really think of us Americans and our human rights leadership when we leave the room. So Lord Owen, I wanted to start with you and ask you to talk about your experience both in Africa and the Balkans of the good, the bad, and the ugly of trying to promote human rights with this superpower that, as Susan Rice just said so forthrightly, both has unprecedented desire and national legacy of promoting human rights, and at the same time, this very complex relationship between how we perceive our human rights interests and how we perceive our national interests.
Well, listening to your earlier debate on your own civil rights movement, I think it is worth remembering that it would have been very difficult for Jimmy Carter to have championed human rights, which he was the first president really to put it as the foremost aspect of their policies, had you not already moved from your position domestically. And it was a very important time. Henry Kissinger had gone to Africa in '76 just for a very short time and visited actually then southern Rhodesia. But you came in with a huge commitment, and there were no differences whatever in the administration on human rights between Spig Brzezinski, Cy Vance, Andy Young, and he was followed by Don McHenry, both in the UN. And it was a very stimulating time, and it was terrific. We went through the threshold of declaring apartheid a threat to the peace. We had mandatory arms embargo. It's an appalling thing to say, but it was the death of Steve Biko in the most ghastly circumstances, being lugged around the back of a lorry, a Land Rover, and coming in prison. And that whole appalling thing tipped the world to go across the sanctions. And had we not done so, I don't think that sanctions would have worked. They had to be mandatory, and slowly, and probably eventually, Swiss bank sanctions were probably the most vital thing. So there were successes, there were faults. I like very much what Dr. Rice said in many respects, but when she said some short-term trade-offs exist, I remember saying and writing a book very early on, don't embark on this if consistency is your only objective. It is quite impossible in the world that we sort of live in to champion human rights and yourself preserve at all times a perfect record of inconsistency. The more you champion it, the harsher your critics will be when you fall from grace. But you have to, as she said, make short-term trade-offs. But that should not stop your commitment to human rights. Just on Africa, I just say very quickly, I sometimes say to students, and just remember Namibia. We went into a negotiation, direct negotiations, rather rare these days, between Vance, myself, Donny Jamison for Canada, and Hans-Dietrich Genscher for Germany, with P.W. Botha, just recently elected president, Pick Botha, the foreign minister, General Milan, Brant Fourie. And for 3 days we negotiated. Eventually we got an agreement. It was that resolution that was then followed in the Security Council, and 12 years later, Namibia went to independence on that resolution. And it sometimes is that length of time that diplomacy takes to actually bring fruition. For as far as Britain was concerned, it was extremely important. The then Labour government had a very small majority. There was a very hardcore right-wing element in Parliament that was not ready to make what we did make, I'm glad to say, no more prevarication, one person, one vote, end of story, no roles, none of all the contorted negotiations. And having a partner in the United States was very helpful in stopping that small but loud and powerful conservative minority pushing hard on a very narrow balance in Parliament, that it was a joint effort, that it was Anglo-American Rhodesian policy, that it was constantly working together on Namibia, working together on... so it was an overall success, I think. And I think Jimmy Carter often gets very unfairly criticized, but I think that his championship of human rights was a very fine example, and I personally find the same enthusiasm of listening to speech we've just heard and seeing Obama. There is that same strand, and very welcome it is. Other thing I would like to say is I regret very much that when I was Foreign Secretary and Jim Callaghan was the Prime Minister, Jimmy Carter wanted to try and help in Northern Ireland. And we were not enthusiastic. We didn't do anything to encourage that. And the General's feeling still was, perhaps because we were sharing Africa, we were not prepared to share Northern Ireland. And there were a lot of political opposition to it. But ever from the moment that Senator Mitchell came in with an extraordinary example of patience, and successive presidents, right up to now, all through, there is very little doubt. It started actually under John Major, continued under all prime ministers, and notably under Tony Blair as well. But we would not have been able to deal with the problems of Ireland by ourselves. We needed outside help, and the help the United States gave us on that was extremely important. And I think this is one of the things that we have got to be more understanding about, is combinations of countries are very, very important. Then we come to the Balkans. Well, I don't hide from you. I think one of the most disastrous statements by any Secretary of State was Warren Christopher's in February 1993 to rule out the use of force in a peace settlement. You cannot send negotiators down into the Balkans in a post-communist states where there's a great shortage of respect for the truth and a very difficult civil war emerging all the time, started almost as a war of aggression, grew into a civil war. You must hold open the use of force. Even if you're not going to do it, don't say it. It's absolutely devastating to a negotiator when dealing with bullies. The day they think that they're not going to be forced is the day you no longer have a hearing, frankly. And I think this is a very important principle, that in wars, and particularly wars of ethnic origins and religious, you have to hold the balance, and you have to be able to think that at some stage you will stand and enforce. And I hold this very, very, very strong principle. And coming then to the whole question of these different interventions that have happened, I believe that George Bush Sr., after a very successful first Iraq intervention in protection of a flagrant abuse of Iraq going into Kuwait, was absolutely right to try and save the Kurds being pushed up into the mountains, if you remember it, in 1991, in terrible circumstances. And I think that no-fly zone was initially an extremely successful policy. I supported no-fly zones in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and again, it was not totally successful, but it was the only thing we could get is an intervention, at least, to rule out, virtually rule out, the Bosnian Serb supremacy in terms of helicopters and planes. My country was the first to argue for, and long argued for it, for 3-4 weeks, that we would have to have a no-fly zone in Libya. But there I think we made again some very bad mistakes, and I deeply regret it. It was extraordinary, given basic Russian attitudes and Chinese attitudes, that they did not. They abstained on that resolution of the... and I think that from then on, we should have bent over backwards to help them when we were really forced by circumstance to go beyond the terms of that resolution. A lot of the problems we have in Syria now stem from the feeling, certainly held passionately by President Putin, that we abused that resolution over Libya, and he'd never let it happen again. And so we had a 2-year standoff, effectively, over Syria in the Security Council. And one thing that's shown us yet again, I mean, I lived through the Cold War when I was Foreign Secretary, and it was always difficult to get the Security Council. One of the good things we did have during the Yeltsin period was a cooperative Russia. It wasn't always helpful, it was a difficult relationship, but there was underlying readiness to cooperate, and it was very helpful indeed. And I think one of the things we've seen over Syria is when the Security Council is locked and no progress can be made, then it's very, very bad for the world. So I've said enough. I think it's, I hold the view the United States has been under successive presidents, basically a champion of human rights. You've fallen from grace like we all have. There's not a single country that can put their hand on their heart and say their human rights record is excellent and has never been impaired and never been impugned. But I think myself that the championing of human rights is the right policy for the United Nations. The championing of democracy is important, but you are never going to make it a universal, or at least not say never. It's going to be a long time before it can be universal. And therefore, human rights, to me, is more important in the United Nations context than democracy as something in which you can rally many more countries. It has a feedback into democracy. It's not divorced from it, of course, but you can lead on human rights. And I think if you take a point in history when it became very important. It was the Helsinki Final Act. The Helsinki Final Act gave us a lever on communist ideology, and we were able to engage. I used to talk to Gromyko, and initially, whenever I started to do human rights, he'd look at the ceiling. It was rather off-putting. A man who's years older than you, and a young upstart talking about human rights, having the foreign minister of Russia looking at it. And he also, I was thinking of Latvia and Lithuania we were hearing earlier, vigorously argued that because we'd signed the human rights of the Helsinki, we had now given up our right to defend the independence of the 3 Baltic states, which we continued to do, and rightly so. So that's just a sideline answer.
But it's a wonderful transition, Dr. Axworthy, to you and your work as Foreign Secretary really very much rallying large numbers of countries, sometimes with the support of the US and sometimes, quite frankly, against us, on to create new international human rights norms.
Well, thank you, Heather. First, I'd like to express my appreciation to Human Rights First for allowing a Canadian to be able to share with you sort of points of view. Normally, for an American audience, we're known as the place where the Arctic cold blasts come from, home of Pamela Anderson, and lately pipelines that nobody seems to want. So the opportunity to kind of spread out that sort of commentary a little bit, I appreciate. And I thought maybe after the very comprehensive and serious, intense remarks of Susan Rice, I might share with you some of the conundrums the Canadian Foreign Minister faces, having to live next door to the United States and share the same piece of rock, because they're always being asked by other countries what it's about. And I do recall just after I retired from government, after close to 30 years in various posts, that I was asked to give a talk at a university in Taiwan. And considering jet lag, I managed to stumble through, because this was the first time I was on my own. I didn't have all those wonderful briefing notes that you get when you're in government. And I got through the end, and then this very smart young man gets up and he said, look, you've been Foreign Minister of Canada for, well, close to 5 years, and can you give us any recommendations, any hints about how you live next door to a big, powerful country? At which point I sort of looked down at my notes and realized that there was no sort of diplomatically, properly coached reason, and it was sort of a blank page. So I drew on my own resources, having grown up in the province of Manitoba. And I said, well, back in Manitoba, we have an old saying, when you make love to a porcupine, do it carefully. It didn't translate into Chinese too well. I found out that along the way. And so the next morning, I'm invited to one of these kind of power breakfasts they have in Taipei. You know, they get up at 5 so they can get on the stock markets early. And as I came into the room, I noticed that the body language wasn't exactly what you'd call warm and fuzzy or forthcoming. And I said to my host, look, have I committed some protocol breach or something? This doesn't seem to be the kind of cordial reception I might expect. He said, well, it may have something to do with the story in this morning's paper about your speech at the university last night. And I said, well, what was it the reporter? Because my Chinese isn't so good either. He said, well, when reported but asked what advice you give, having been a foreign minister dealing with the United States and now giving us advice on how to deal with big China, your answer was, well, it's like making love to a concubine. So if you want to translate that into some new form of foreign policy direction, you can probably get some academic to write an MA thesis on it along the way. But it does sort of, I think, highlight something really important, that very much of what we do, our foreign policy, is clearly conditioned by the fact that we share a border, a geography, a language, a culture, an exchange, the largest trading relationship in the world, and in many cases, similar values. So it's not as a matter that we're sort of living with hostile border guards, although that's increasing as we get more into border security. There's more people with guns and sort of surveillance equipment. But it really does mean that there is a constant sort of watch, unlike an American audience, which pays limited attention. I mean, our basic view is how do we both distinguish ourselves, and in particular, I think, as the country becomes increasingly more economically significant. It's the 6th largest economy in the world and has increasingly a smart population with a very good foreign service, and I would say with some alas, a government that isn't quite so activist as its predecessor was. But what it does come about are two things. First, when I think of the impact that the position of human rights as manifest in the United States, the first thing I think about is not what government is doing so much, but what is coming out of the NGO community, the academy, the foundations. This is an enormous source of ideas, of support, of commitment, of action that really does have reverberation around the world. I was a student here in the early 60s, and I was involved in civil rights marches, Birmingham, and standing outside the Democratic Convention and things of that kind. Also the time of the student movement, time of the protests in Vietnam. What was fascinating about that experience is I was like millions of other students, young people, who have come to the United States for an education and have come away with a clear impression that not only do you talk the talk, but walk the talk. That for all the sometimes messy ways it happens, this is a country who continually struggles with its human rights issues. I think that that is one of the most important and crucial messages that I guess Joe and I call soft power, but it is a strong signal that one that is worldwide in its reach. I was on the board of the MacArthur Foundation for several years. And I was amazed that here's this foundation that gives away hundreds of millions of dollars every year, and a large proportion of it goes to human rights actions in Russia, in India, in the Americas, in Haiti. I mean, it is part of its program. That is very rare. I mean, I don't know if Americans fully understand just how broad an impact that has, to say nothing of the way in which the incredible action and networking that takes place through organizations like your own and others in being able to pinpoint human rights abuses, being able to react to them, being able to be advocates of them. That has, especially in this information-based age, has an incredible reach and connection. And so I think, in a way, one of the things that always impressed me was just how much that was a factor. And if, let me give you an example. We were, in many ways, heavily involved in the development of the anti-personnel landmines campaign. Let me give you a background. After the Cold War, a lot more rubble was available than just the stones from the Berlin Wall. A lot of rubble was a bunch of old ideas that didn't work anymore. A lot of conventional wisdoms that had been just, when you had a bipolar world, you had built around certain military theories, certain diplomatic theories, and all of a sudden the wall comes down. And one of the things that we did at Foreign Affairs was to try to search our way through for some new architecture. What kind of world would it be without these kind of strict dichotomies in the world? And the one thing that we latched onto, because we felt it suited our own human rights values, was the human security concept that the United Nations had come forward. The United Nations Development Program said that security is as important for people and individuals as it is for nation states and governments. That we have to begin developing a set of standards and norms and treaties and institutions that have as their purpose protection for people as much as it is for protection of nation states. It was a revision of sovereignty in a way, not getting rid of it, not replacing it, but simply saying that sovereignty, the right of government, has to be judged to the degree to which it protects its own people. That is the test of sovereignty, not sort of some abstraction that 19th century or 18th century philosopher had. It's an earned right. And it was based on that that we began to see how could we begin to help redefine an international architecture around that basic issue of human security, the protection of people, and the landmine campaign. But it was started in this country. It was Bobby Mueller, head of the Vietnam's Vets organization, who, when his veterans came back from Vietnam, there was more injuries according to landmines than there was by enemy fire. And Bobby Mueller was the one that put the money into setting up an international coalition. And it was Senator Leahy, who's speaking to you tomorrow, who issued the very first call in the Congress for banning the exports of landmines. And it was President Clinton who gave the very first speech at the General Assembly asking for a ban of landmines. So when it came to be something that was a universal statement on how you provide protection for people, it didn't have anything to do with economics or oil fields or so on. It simply said, everybody in the world, there's at that time 60, 70,000 people being killed, being maimed, being disabled. That was just a universal thing. It was what Kofi Annan called a problem without a passport. Well, the initiation for it really started in this country by a series of both political and private initiatives. I think Americans forget that oftentimes, that it really began here. What happened is that then sort of the politics clicked in, and the domestic influence of the military and others said, we're not ready to sign a treaty. We're going to just negotiate around the edges to that. Well, we pushed the treaty. We got 120 countries to come to Ottawa. We got it signed. We came in, by the way, within a half an hour of negotiation with President Clinton and Sandy Berger and to get it signed. And I remember calling my wife up and saying, you know, that 15-year-old ball of Macallan's we've been saving for a special occasion, open it up, I'm coming home. I think we've got the United States aboard. Half an hour later, Sandy Berger calls and says, no, the president's decided not to. The Pentagon has stepped in over Korea and a few other things. I said, get the bottle open anyway, I really need it. If you think that's the way Canadians conduct foreign policy, you're right. That helps. Anyway, that happened, but the same kind of technique we used became involved with the International Criminal Court, even on a larger scale, because what was that about? As Lord Owen knows, it's been around since between the first two world wars. But the basic point was it was going to hold governments accountable, whether you're a prime minister, a president, a general, a foreign minister. If you deliberately decided to undertake a crime against humanity, a genocide, and that became part of your policy, you were going to be held accountable in the court. It wasn't going to be ad hoc. It wasn't going to be sort of, we're going to get you. It's going to be a legal process, which what better way can you establish a system internationally than to have a rule of law with a proper institution? I mean, if there's ever an ultimate expression of human right sort of positioning, it's to have an institution based on a law which holds everybody by equal judgment and have it done by due process of law. And again, it became a problem to get the United States to sign in. At one point, at the end of his term, President Clinton did sign on. It was then denounced by President Bush. Similarly, you've got the treaties on disabilities, signed but not ratified. Treaty on women, discrimination against women, not ratified. Children, not ratified. I mean, I don't want to make a big deal of this, but having a treaty agreed to by the United States does carry enormous lift. It means that all those other countries who aren't signing on have an excuse. Well, if the Americans aren't doing it, they are the human rights country. Listen to their standards, listen to what they say. But if they don't see it's worth signing, now, I understand. There's complications in Congress and there's constitutional issues. But nevertheless, the absence in these, what I would call humanitarian law cases, setting up an alternative. Heather, if I can just add one further issue, because I think it comes back to a contemporary issue that maybe we can chat about. one of the things that, again, I give my applause to is that we were on the Security Council. In fact, I was president of the Security Council at the time of Kosovo. And everything had been tried at that time with Milosevic to stop the murder, to stop the ethnic cleansing. And all the diplomatic sort of fandangos simply didn't work. And it was only then that Secretary of State Albright said, look, we'd like to do it to the UN. The Russians are going to veto. What can we do? So a group of us, including my own country, said, let's take it to NATO. Let's see if we can get an endorsement. We did. There was an 80-day bombing campaign. Toughest thing I ever had to do was to recommend to my cabinet that we participate. But within days of negotiation, Milosevic was before the Balkan Tribunal charged with war crimes. Was there a connection? I believe so. I believe that there was a connection between getting involved and getting engaged and basically Milosevic losing his political base in Serbia. However, and I discussed this with the Secretary of State, discussed it with the Secretary General. I said, you know, what we need is a little bit more of a formal, organized framework under which we do intervention, do engagement. We can't be doing it ad hoc. We can't go in because some leader of some country thinks it's time to do it. We have to decide what's the criteria, what's the level of response so that you don't kind of go in there in a total war machine. And it was out of that, through a commission that we established, came responsibility to protect. Very simple. If a government won't protect its people, or can't protect its people, or is the perpetrator of crimes against its people, there's an international responsibility. And it's that area where I still think that there is a huge, massive, big human rights debate to be taking place in the United States. Again, there was not involved in it. It did pass in 2005, a General Assembly ratification. The leaders signed on to it. There was mention of R2P in Sudan, Darfur, Libya. But let's just say it's been a reluctant, not so active commitment. Susan Rice, who spoke here today, before, when she was President Obama's policy writer before the election, wrote in the New York Times about it. And I still think that that is one of the great human rights issues, is that we can't let mass murder to continue. We can't let go what's going on in Syria continue. I think it's a disaster. It's a human rights disaster of a proportion that we will be so embarrassed as an international community, as a group of people, Americans, Canadians, that sure, we've got sidelines into chemical weapons, great. But the killing is going on. The starvation is going on. There's proposals out there that maybe Putin and Obama should get together and at least provide some place in which humanitarian aid can be delivered into the cities so people don't starve to death. In other words, I just don't think that there's enough serious sort of effort, energy, commitment, and thought being put in to what to do about Syria. And as a result, I think we're allowing the whole system of international criminal law and impunity of leaders to begin to erode. If we let that erode, I think the 21st century will not be a pleasant one.
So Lord Owen, that immediately calls the mind back to some of the things you said about the Bosnia experience, that you have this situation where the American role is both the enabling and the disenabling aspect in that. And how much of what we're seeing in Syria, the inability of the international community to come together around something that would actually be effective in stopping the violence, can be traced either to the shortcomings you pointed to in the Libya operation, or even further back to some of the ways that the international community, or specifically the US, operated in the 90s?
Well, I think this is very difficult. It's a key issue. Whether we like it or not, we learnt from the failure of the League of Nations, and in San Francisco, we accepted veto powers. We wouldn't have had a United Nations if we hadn't done so. That's the fact of life. And it is no good, this endless wailing that goes on, usually in NGOs, about the veto powers. It exists. And the fundamental one is Russia. Now, President Bush Sr. might have been able, when the collapse of the Soviet Empire took place, to deprive Russia of their veto power. Be very difficult to say it was a new country, it was different, it couldn't be the inheritor. That might have been an opportunity to get rid of the veto for Soviet, with the death of the Soviet Union. I don't think that really did exist. And I think he was on a different course, which was try to make Russia a more productive member of the Security Council. And remember, when I first was there in '77, China was practically a non-participant, abstaining on every resolution. Slowly, gradually, we have been able to have periods where the Security Council has worked. And I think that really Syria is an absolute example that Russia and China felt we took advantage of them over Libya. And all right, there were good reasons why we did. The thing was very difficult to handle from the air. We were banned from putting troops on the ground. Of course, we had certain special forces there. And I don't think anybody made great mistakes. I don't think it was just, we were not able to bridge this gap. I think it would have been a very good thing if the NATO-Russian Council had had a practical meeting of generals and air marshals and things like that and say, all right, well, what are your objections? What are we doing wrong? Why do you not? We didn't have a dialogue. And now we've got a breakthrough. We are back into a discussion about Syria. We are due to hold a meeting in Geneva on the 22nd. Quite frankly, while the fighting is going on for critical territory in the suburbs of Damascus, it may well be postponed again. And I don't think we can envisage this issue like a sort of Western-dominated peace process. The Middle East has got to own this Syrian issue. We handed them the maps in 1919 and in the negotiations in Paris and the Treaty of Versailles. The flaws in the 1919 settlement are visible every day in Syria and in the rest of a lot of the wars, the former Yugoslavia wars, were definitely influenced by the 1919 settlement. The endless wars in Iraq have also been. And this, we have got to keep a regional conference. I mean, the Security Council powers can help. And China has interests. They are more dependent on Gulf oil than the United States. Somebody said to me the other day that in the tankers leaving the Gulf, 75% turn left. That wasn't the situation 20 or 30 years ago. And I think we have got to therefore look at this whole thing of how do we break the deadlock of the Russia and China are totally opposed, really, to the right to intervene. Yeah. They went along with it with you, but they didn't agree to change the UN Charter.
I don't think unalterably. I was at a meeting in Korea 2 weeks ago with a very senior Chinese delegate, chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, very able, who basically said, get us involved. Let's not make it just sort of the old boys game. I mean, let's do something which makes sense. Let's use our relationships that we are establishing economically. The whole pivot of the United States into Asia has been primarily a military pivot. It hasn't been a political, diplomatic pivot. And that was clearly stated. I think there is an agenda there that can be worked on. There's a real agenda on the whole issue of transportation issues. They're scared crazy of going through the Malacca Straits. It's just too crowded and there's too many parts. What's the chance of looking at other alternatives? Going through the Northwest or the Northeast? But I think that we've narrowed the agenda too much. We're still kind of thinking a little bit in, as I said, in a little bit of the box that came out of the Berlin Wall, that we haven't really reassembled it. We haven't really put together an agenda that involves. You've got the same thing with emergent states. Brazil has a very fascinating paper on R2P that is really has a number of important suggestions. who engages with them on that? How do we get that involved? So I believe we're in a little bit of a trough right now internationally.
Speaking of engaging with Brazil, let me turn you quickly.
Okay, I'm sorry.
And then because we need to let the audience in on this. But you've both alluded to the idea that the U.S. can be a major force for human rights, even though, what did you say, we fall from grace. We've fallen pretty far from grace right now with many of our allies, including and friends, including Brazil, over the question of surveillance. And we heard Dr. Rice give a pretty full-throated defense of surveillance. So now imagine yourselves back in the roles that you formerly occupied. How is it possible, how is cooperation with the U.S. on human rights limited or damaged by what's gone on and by what you heard this afternoon?
Can I do a mea culpa from my own country? 2 days ago, it was admitted that CSEC, which is our NSA, approved the NSA bugging the G20 meeting that was held in Toronto. So when we say, wash your own hands, Judas, there's a lot of countries who are sort of engaged. But it does come back to the question. I don't think that, and I'm going to be kind of tough, I don't think we've spent enough time in the human rights community really framing these issues and putting the kind of political questions to bear. I can't tell you what's happening in the United States on this issue, but I just don't think that there's much of a public voice on this thing. People are too overwhelmed by the technology. The security issue seems to trump in a lot of cases. But surely we're smart enough to get the balance. We've got enough smart people in the field so that we don't have to be kind of purloining all the time.
Well, it's still quite a tricky issue for me to talk about. We are into it up to our necks.
Yeah,
so there's not much difference between the US and the British position. I do believe that as this technology was starting to develop, we came into a moral and ethical question, that the surveillance was all-inclusive and the technology drives it in that way. It's almost impossible. And yet we were refusing to recognize that there were things like friendships and allies and relationships. I did engage in this. I was very young and idealistic, and I believed that there were ways of cracking this issue, and I still believe there are. I do think it is intolerable. Just to take a simple thing, we are still in trading blocs. Trading blocs meet and have negotiated positions, and then they go into the negotiation. If you allow your own element in the surveillance to pass on to another trading bloc, your own collective position, you are putting yourself into a totally immoral position. And that's really what has been going on in a lot of these areas. So the danger is what comes up if you raise this question in Britain, you're immediately said you'll endanger the special intelligence relationship. And you therefore just don't discuss it, and you're blocked from discussing it. On one occasion, I had a frank one-on-one conversation with the head of the CIA about this issue. And I was told, in fact, they didn't really like me to have the conversation, but since there were only two people in the room, and he's now dead, nobody can tell exactly. All I can tell you is that the head of the CIA at that stage, and some of you could work out who it was a military figure, completely understood what I was talking about, understood the moral and the ethical questions, and believed that it was possible to crack this problem. And difficult, very difficult. But there had to be goodwill, there had to be understanding. We all had to understand, be grown up, and realize that you couldn't go on with this blanket surveillance, blanket intelligence, and not use some measure of discrimination amongst friends and allies. And there is no doubt, if Oskar Fischer was here, he would be telling you that the Germans are deeply affronted by this.
Right.
And they have every right to be. They are, in any normal sense of the term, as close to the United States as Britain. The British talk about a special relationship. Damn it, I think it was one vote that stopped German being the language of the United States of one of your founding. They have every right to be part and trusted in this whole area, and they feel affronted. And these politicians are going to have to find a way over this. So I look at her, there was one sentence which she at least acknowledged that there is a problem. There have been times in the last few weeks where some of us have wondered whether the United States was even going to recognize there is a problem. Once you recognize there's a problem, there's a way through it. Untidy, difficult, and it'll still have problems with some countries, and Brazil might be one of them.
Well, let's take a few questions from the floor before the end of our session. I believe we have microphones that are coming around, so
When do we finish? What?
wave your hand. And okay. Thanks, back by the door. And because we've got 10 minutes, tell us who you are, and please actually ask a question.
Thank you. My name is Maina Kiai, and my question is around the International Criminal Court, and I wanted to hear what both the guests think about the recent amendments to the International Criminal Court, the rules of procedure that now seem to distinguish and discriminate between people who are presidents and those who are not presidents, and the fact that the United Kingdom actually was one of the proposers of the idea of having video links if you're a president, but if you're an ordinary person, you have to go in person.
Well, I'm a practical man, and if that means that you can get the trial off the ground with the president of Kenya on a video link, I have no problem with that at all. So I'm not a member of the present British government, and I don't even support it. But I don't think that I would have been against that. The problem with the criminal court is we went ahead without having the key countries involved. Now, we took a gamble in doing that. The British government did, and Canada did. I think rightly. But it was not possible to get the United States on board, not possible to get Russia, not possible to get India, not possible to get China. Well, you've only got to mention those 4 countries and not be members, and you're going to have to make a lot more compromises to get them on board. And this is just the start of it. So this idea that this pure organization can be established, and you just stand pat and wait for these other countries to join, they ain't going to do it. And therefore, we have to go back and patiently look and make concessions, and hopefully not make the crucial concession. The crucial concession these countries, by and large, want is they want the restoration of the veto in the organization. Right. And you've not got to let them do that. And you've got to somehow find a way, maneuvering your way through this very difficult. It's a good institution to have been established. It has many imperfections. Vance and I were very much involved in the establishment of the court in the former Yugoslavia. It was a special court. We'd have liked it to be in a criminal court. It's had lots of problems, lots of teething ground, but I still think it's a great deal better than not having anything. And therefore, I will play at the pragmatist and make changes like that so that Kenyatta does actually give evidence to the court while president of Kenya.
Do you
I have a certain conflict because I sit on the advisory committee for the International Court. And this issue did come up. I think Lord Owen properly expressed that it is a way of using new technology. Courts are using it all the time now, so it's not. And it would be a way, I think, of correcting what I thought was probably some issues with the prosecution that needed to be remanaged. I think that there needs to be a proper discussion. I think the court, if you allow me to say it, and I've said it in the advisory committee, is still acting too much as if it was a detached court as opposed to one that has a much stronger political role to play in a small p sense. But it also needs a lot more support from its friends, from its advisors. It's really being isolated right now. People are not sort of, and I agree fully that the absence of the United States as a member has really provided a deterrent to serious, broader universal recruitment. because it's so easy to say, well, if they're not there, we don't have to carry responsibility for it. You know, it's the first and only new institution in this 21st century. It's focused on an issue that is absolutely crucial, which is the impunity of government to murder or kill its own people. What could be more crucial than that? How much progress have we made up to now to give it up now? But I think it really does need a significant push, and if I can be so presumptuous, if you like, that this organization, which has such a strong legal network that it works with, could be very helpful in getting that legal network to look at the issue, to have it studied in the academy, to do all these things in order to start reigniting some momentum and some enthusiasm. And particularly in the case of with Jomo Kenyatta, I think that there is a way of reconciling those questions. It's just that nobody out there is acting as the negotiator. Nobody is acting as the broker.
So if each of you had the opportunity to talk to President Obama as he thinks about his legacy at the end of the second term and say, if there were one or two things that you could do or do differently, Mr. President, that you were going to use your resources on that would really make a big difference in the field of human rights, what would you advise the President to focus on, not focus on, do, or stop doing in the next 3 years?
Well, okay.
You're their neighbor.
I would change your weather broadcast so we don't get blamed for all the cold weather. Now, I think that the most important thing the President can do is to really devote serious attention to what's happening in Syria on the humanitarian side. I don't expect that he's going to negotiate a ceasefire, but there are immediate steps in terms of providing a temporary ceasefire, a zone, if you want, no fly zone, but certainly a humanitarian zone for the delivery of supplies. I don't think you can allow people to continue to die the way they are doing. And it may also include some serious talk during the discussions with Iran to get them to begin to lay off their arms and support, and with the Saudis on the same side. I just really think that Syria has been pushed to the sideline. And I think it will emerge probably as the single most, the next generation will hold this account, not just because we allowed so many people to be killed. I think its repercussions, its implications for that region, for the global economy. I think we're living really on the edge by letting that issue explode, the sectarian conflicts to grow. I think that we're really watching something. What was the famous stuff? A chronicle of a
death foretold.
Chronicle of a death untold. That's exactly what we're watching right now, and I just think that there isn't enough serious give into it, even though I think there's pieces there. Talk to Putin, talk to the Chinese, get involved in it, and get involved personally in it.
So I'm going to tease you a little bit, and I'm going to say you'd give up treaty ratification to get Syria.
Yeah, I think in this case, I just think the depth and breadth of killing is so widespread, and the political outcome is so volatile that we'd have to do it, even though I would have it as a very close second.
Well, I must say the same, but in a different way. I am married to an American. She's an Obama mama, and I am too. And I am very proud of the House of Commons for its vote against going into Syria. I think this was an ill-judged intervention. I think that it was purely and simply that Obama was pressurized because he'd made this red line issue, and understandably. I've been ready to go into Syria right from the moment it started. I've looked at it every day almost, and I've never yet felt that you could do it. The problem is that Russia is there with real and substantial interests, and Iran was there with real and substantial interests. The situation is now far worse. Saudi Arabia are pouring money and arms in, irrespective of whether as long as they're Sunni, it doesn't matter whether they're Al-Qaeda or anything else. The thing is becoming a surrogate war with Iran engaged through Hezbollah and others, their own direct forces as well, Saudi Arabia putting direct forces in and putting money in it. This is a very dangerous thing. So I think it is the highest priority. I thought Obama's response to the British House of Commons vote in 2 days' time is brilliant. Why not let Congress have a vote? Humbug of Congress on Syria was demonstrated within an hour as they queued up to say why they shouldn't go. And with one bound, he was free. And then, I like to think I made a little bit, I made many speeches in this thing. I couldn't see why we were spending a whole time arguing about who had triggered the chemical weapons. The fact they were there was a scandal. And I think we've moved tremendous progress, and this institution, The Hague, has done a very great job. Now America offering a ship and to destroy it on it. This is a big Obama decision, incidentally, for which he deserves credit. Now it seems to me that Kerry is devoting a lot of attention, is getting on well with Lavrov. They are doing their utmost to get this conference going. The question is, do we go there? And we've got an excellent envoy, Lakid Brahimi, is a very good thing. Are you going to load them up and say, you could take views on the criminal court, you take views on whether or not there's going to be partition, and you have to keep it together, like the terrible problem we were told, you cannot make any change in the regional boundaries of Yugoslavia from 1991 onwards. The EU wanted it and didn't, they then backed off it. And I think go into that conference with an open mind, but with the real commitment of the United States. And I think that it is now going to be the signature tune of Obama. If he can deliver a settlement, I totally would agree with you. This is the issue. And he's got to get a settlement. We've made huge mistakes. We've all made mistakes. But it was never going to be an easy one to crack. But out there is a Sunni, Shia, deep-seated, long-continued fighting and destruction of the Middle East. And there's even the issue of the Palestinian and Israel is secondary. Israel should be at that conference, and so should Iran. And the United States should be putting all their diplomatic effort behind getting a ceasefire and getting lines, even if they're de facto partition for a while. And I don't think we should be against, if need be, changing the map. The map was a lousy map, and it was made by the British, and the Sykes-Picot line is a disgrace, and it was when it was done.
Well, what I hear both of you saying is that our allies can, and indeed we depend on you to push the institutions and structures of human rights forward in the world. But when it comes to moments of decision, moments where a combination of intense diplomacy, maybe some military power is used in the world, that you need.
You are essential.
That is what we are essential for, but not to lose also that what is essential about the U.S. is not just our government, but in fact, the folks who brought us here together today, who I heard you both say, not just push our government to be better, but push your governments to be better as well. So please join me in thanking the two ministers for this presentation.